Hi, so I'm very excited to be here presenting my PhD work. The title of my talk is Distributed and Localized Model Predictive Control. So let's imagine that we have to control the water system in this plantation, and that we need to do that by minimizing the cost, the amount of water that we spend, and also the energy that we spend in moving all these gates, and that we need to stay within some constraints. So we don't want the water level to be so low that it doesn't get to water the plants, but also not so high that it overflows. So in control theory, we do this with a controller. We measure the water level, and the controller tells us how we have to activate the gates. And we do so by taking into account the previous considerations. So we minimize the cost subject to the dynamics of the plant, the constraints on the state and the input, and the measurement that we just took as an initial condition. And if I were to write this mathematically, we call this model predictive control. And if we were to write this mathematically, this is how we would write it. So I'm assuming here that the costs are convex functions. For the plant dynamics, I'm going to restrict myself to linear systems only. And for the constraints right now, I'm just modeling them as convex sets. And here's the initial condition. And the way model predictive control works is we measure the state of the plant. We use it as the initial condition for the dynamics and the minimization. We solve for a series of inputs over a finite time horizon, but we only apply the first one to the plant, and we keep going iteratively. And model predictive control has been used in a wide variety of applications because of its ability to handle constraints. But let's go back to our plantation. And in this example, the decision is being made in the centralized controller station, and then it's broadcasted to the gates so they can actuate. But what happens if we wanted each of these gates to have agency and make their own decisions while coordinating with the neighbors? Well, this is the case for many large-scale systems that also we also want to control optimally, but they're subject to hard constraints. And unfortunately, their dimension is too large to be embedded in the centralized setup that I described. Because if we were to do this, we would be missing the structure that the network has, and it would also be computationally very costly, sometimes even unfeasible. So what people have been doing instead is they have been designing this distributed model predictive control, where each of the subsystems has its own controller, and they coordinate with each other to solve this global solution. But a lot of the times, the sparsity of these problems hinders finding this globally optimal solution, because the global information exchanges that we had in the centralized setting are hard to achieve in this setting.
Pues estoy en ello, ¿sabes?
Can people mute themselves, please?
No.
Okay, so what we did instead is we actually took advantage of the sparsity of these networks, and we're creating an isolated neighborhood for each of the subsystems. So in this case, subsystem I only depends on the subsystems in their neighborhoods, but in their neighborhood, but nothing else outside. So it effectively looks for each of the subsystems as if the network was this big, and they're agnostic to the fact that this is a large network. And this was our main insight, and this has proven to be very useful for a variety of results that I'll describe throughout this talk. The dimension of this neighborhood is a parameter that we can tune, and here is how we impose this constraint. So this is what we call a locality constraint, and here we're restricting the state and the input of the system to only depend on states, inputs, models, disturbances of the neighborhood, but nothing else. So we call our approach distributed and localized model predictive control. And what we'll show today is that this framework exhibits robustness, scalability, and minimally conservative guarantees. We also show its global optimality under some conditions, and that it can be implemented in hardware very efficiently, and that it has lower data requirements. So I've organized this talk in this way, where throughout the different works that I did, you'll see all these features that I alluded to. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to ensure a distributed synthesis and implementation for this approach. So we have to design these controllers, right? But beyond that, we also need minimally conservative guarantees. So sometimes a model predictive control can fail and cannot. Sometimes it doesn't give us a solution or the solution we want. So we want guarantees to avoid that, to prevent that from happening. We also were able to achieve this globally optimal solution as compared to the non-localized MPC. And we have done an efficient GPU parallelization of this work, and also we have extended this to data-driven case. So I'll start talking about the fundamental part of this work, which is how do we design these controllers in the first place? So that involves distributed and localized implementation and distributed and localized synthesis. When I'm talking about distributed and localized implementation, I'm talking about how to design all of these tiny controllers and make them behave like a big centralized one. When I'm talking about distributed and localized synthesis, it's a different question. I'm asking, how do we take this big global optimization problem and distribute it among the into subproblems for the different subsystems to solve their own? So let's see how we can do this. Well, first, this is the vanilla MPC problem that I introduced earlier. But a lot of the times, what people do is they optimize over control policies as opposed to control input. So that's this gamma function that you see there. But treating the problem in this way, it's computationally intractable a lot of the times. So what people try, because we don't really have defined here what's the space of gammas or anything like that. So what people try to do to deal with this closed loop solution is either they rely on extended centralized methods, but unfortunately these approaches often rely on strong assumptions, or they rely on a parametrization of a dynamic feedback policy. And when people do that, they actually achieve very effectively to design this distributed implementation of the controllers, but unfortunately they lack scalability because the optimization problem that leads to that is a centralized synthesis, and it's not amenable for distribution. So what we propose to do is we also rely on a dynamic feedback policy, a parameterization of a dynamic feedback policy, but we also introduce the locality constraints in order to capture the structure of the network. And that means that our policy is going to look something like this. But now solving this optimization problem is a hard problem because we're restricting the dependencies of the decision variables. So let me tell you how we can tackle that. We rely on the system level synthesis parametrization, and just to introduce notation, let me tell you about it. So we have this closed loop system for a linear plant. So this is how we write the dynamics of the plant. And alternatively, this is another way to write it, where we're stacking the time instantations of the dynamics in this way. So we have this matrix notation, and this is how we can write the dynamics. For the controller, we can do the same, but now this is a convolution operation. So instead of having the block diagonal matrices that we had earlier, now we have this block lower triangular operator for K. And that's the notation that we're going to use. Now, what SLS does is it strips away the distinction between plant and controller, and instead designs this closed loop maps directly, the maps between disturbance and state and disturbance and input. And the structure of this maps, just for reference, is the same as in the controller, where each of the entries there is a matrix on its own right. So how do we know that each of this closed loop maps are actually capturing the dynamics of the system? Well, we know that this subspace parameterizes all possible system responses. So, so we know that if that is the case, then our closed loop maps are parameterizing the closed loop behavior, are capturing the closed loop behavior of the system. So we can go back to what we had and perform the simple change of variables, where here for the cost and the constraints are just changing variables. And for the dynamics, we can rely on the SLS theorem because we know that this subspace is capturing the dynamics. But I still haven't told you how we're going to deal with this locality constraints. So let's go back to the SLS parameterization. And the second statement of the SLS theorem tells us that this controller, in terms of phi-u and phi-x, achieves the desired response. And that is really important because that means that we can implement the controller in that way. And that means that structure imposed in phi-x and phi-u directly translates to structure in the controller. And let me explain that a little bit more. So in SLS, in MPC, and this would work if this wasn't the case, but because this is the case, it's going to make it nicer for me to explain. In MPC, we only need the first input. We compute for a series of inputs, but we really only apply the first one. So that means that we only, in this setting, we only care about those matrices. So I can take advantage of that just for the sake of this explanation and write out exactly what the implementation looks like for this 3-node system. And now something I could try to do is I could try to distribute the rows of this matrices into the for each of the controllers, because green subsystem is only going to have to compute U1, so it might as well just implement its own row. However, I'm not getting very far here because the green subsystem still needs to, it still requires information from blue subsystem in order to perform this computation. So we're still stuck with this global communication exchanges. However, here's where this statement comes in very handy, because since phi-x and phi-u are decision variables of my optimization, I can choose the structure that they have. And in particular, I can set these components to be 0 so that I don't need anymore this communication link between green and blue. And so in this way, we have achieved this local communication exchanges. A caveat here is that I can only do that if the plant is sparse enough. So sometimes imposing this constraint results in unfeasibilities, but thankfully for a lot of the large scale networks, they exhibit this sparse structure so that they are amenable for this, to imposing these constraints with no problem. So basically imposing locality constraints in this framework boils down to tweaking basically selecting the structure of phi-x and phi-u, and this is an affine constraint. So we can go back to what we had. And this is a problem statement that we have now in terms of SLS. And just without realizing, we have achieved this distributed and localized implementation just by using SLS, because we can implement the controllers as I described, and that is already distributed and localized. But now, and here is where most of the methods that rely on this parameterization, on a parameterization for solving distributed MPC stop, because their mathematical problem is not amenable for distribution. But we're going to show how ours is. So I think I should talk about the elephant in the room here, which is how am I going to deal with this robustness constraint? So that's what I'll do next. But before I do that, let me just make a change of variables just to make this look a little bit nicer. And I'm not really doing anything here. I'm only going to stack phi-x and phi-u. I'm not doing any algebra. And this is what the problem statement is going to look like. And so now I can examine this constraint a little bit closer, and whether I can tackle this constraint or not really boils down to the structure of the constraint set P and the disturbance set W. So when W is basically this 0, that means I don't have disturbances, so I can tackle this. This is the nominal case, and in that case, notice that I've written this bracket 1 because that means that we only care about the first block column of this phi matrix. Everything else we don't need to compute because it's going to be multiplied by 0. So that is also advantageous computationally. Another case that we can tackle is when both these constraints are polytopic. And in that case, what I'm doing is I'm using duality to reformulate this constraint into this other constraint where the dual variable is showing up there. So it's the Xi variable. So that is going to increase our computational complexity. But thankfully, this Xi variable is also localizable. So it has this local structure, and it's going to let me, we will be able to still take advantage of that for the distribution and the localization of the computation. And And the third case that we can tackle is when the noise is locally bounded and the constraints are still polytopic. And in that case, I can again do duality, but in this case, I don't even need the dual variable here because this is just a dual norm. So these are the cases that we can tackle, but now just for simplicity of my explanation, I'm going to show you how it works in the nominal case. It works exactly the same for the robust case. So we have something like that. And now I'm going to introduce an assumption. The assumption is that cost and constraints do not introduce any coupling. So if I'm a subsystem, my cost and my constraints only depend on my state and my input and nothing else in the network. So that means that these two elements, the cost and the constraints, are row-wise separable. Let me explain that a little bit. So each state and input correspond to a row of this phi matrix. So what we can do is we can distribute the rows of phi into each of the subsystems. So we can write this cost and this constraints in this way. So they're row-wise separable. For this other constraint now, we have, by the way, matrix multiplication works. If I wanted to distribute this computation across the different subsystems, this is how I would distribute this computation. So this computation is column-wise separable. And that means that this is a partially separable problem. And the way to deal with partial separable problems, a very common way, is to use ADMM. I'm not going to get into the details here, but basically, if I have an optimization in terms of two decision variables, and they're decoupled, except they're coupled through an affine constraint, then I can separate the optimizations in terms of those two, and then I have a third step for an ADMM update step. So I can do that now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to write the row-wise separable problems in terms of phi, and the column-wise separable problems in terms of psi. And this is what my ADMM problem looks like. And now I can go ahead and apply ADMM to it because phi and psi are mostly decoupled, except they're coupled through an affine constraint. So I can do that. And now I can go ahead and actually separate these problems into the rows and the columns of the subsystems. So this is what they look like. And the dimensions of each of these subproblems is smaller than the size of the network, because each of the subproblems do not have to solve for their full row or column that they were assigned, but only for a patch, because most of those components are zero anyway because of the locality constraints. And we'll see that in simulation too. So just for reference, this is when we have this robust case, we only put a tilde everywhere, and then the decision variables become a little bit bigger, but that's about it. So we have this 3-node network. Let me explain how the algorithm would work here. So if we're the green subsystem, because of the locality constraints, we don't talk to the blue subsystem. So we start by computing the row-wise part. So that means that in this phi matrix, we have, we're only computing the first row of phi. And instead of computing all 3 elements, we're only computing 2 because of locality constraints. So we compute this optimization problem, and then we go ahead and we share information with the neighbors because we want to reconstruct the first column of phi. So we go ahead and do that. And now we go into the psi subproblem. So now we're computing the column, the corresponding column of this psi matrix, which for the green subsystem is the first one. And again, it's 2 components instead of 3. And then we use the information that we just received to compute the for this column in this way. And then again, we share with the neighbors. We want to reconstruct the rows. So we do that. And finally, we do the ADMM update step, and we keep going until convergence of this ADMM algorithm. And so in this way, we have achieved the distributed and localized synthesis besides the distributed and localized implementation that we already had. So we have achieved the first part of our works today. Let me show you how this works in simulation. So we have this grid where the dynamics of each of the nodes is this two-state oscillator, a linearized oscillator. So we're looking at what's happening in that node. This is the evolution of its states with time. And in the noiseless case, we can stay within the constraints. We don't violate the constraints. And our solution is the same as in the centralized case with locality constraints. In the locally, when we have noise, the nominal case doesn't work anymore, and you see that it violates the constraints. But now we have our approach to deal with this bounded noise actually keeps us within the bounds, and that's also true when we have polytopic noise. In terms of scalability of this approach, and this is what I'm referring to early, because the sizes of the computations only depend on the local patches and not the entire network, here I'm showing the runtime of the simulation with and how that changes when we increase the size of the network. And overall, it does not change and it plateaus because precisely that, the computation is dominated by the size of the neighborhood. And actually, this is what happens. I just showed you here what happens when we solve this in a centralized solver. It scales much worse than when we do it in this with our algorithm, basically. And let me show you here what happens when we when we look at the runtime with the size of the neighborhood, which I said was what dominates. And in fact, you see here, even though this is in log and semi-log scale, and we're only increasing the size of the neighborhood by a bit, you're already seeing this the runtime is degrading much more. And that also happens with the time horizon. So that's all we have. We have achieved a distributed and localized synthesis and implementation, but now a lot of the times with MPC approaches, that's not enough. We want guarantees to make sure that their behavior is safe and it's something that we expect. So here are some issues that can happen with MPC just by its nature, because we keep recomputing the input. Something that could happen is that our trajectory just gets stuck because of the constraints. It gets to a point where it's no longer feasible and the controller doesn't give us any more solutions. Of course, we don't want any of that to happen. We want guarantees that we will always be able to compute the next step. So we want recursive feasibility guarantees. We also want asymptotic stability guarantees. So a lot of the times we want to track a reference and we want to make sure that we stay close to this reference. We don't want to oscillate up and down. So we want something like that. So in the literature, what people have been doing to guarantee these things is either they rely on this offline computation of the guarantees, which is efficiently computationally because it doesn't add to the computational burden online, but it's conservative. Or some other times people rely on online computations of these guarantees, so they're adding to the computational burden of this of the MPC, even though they're a little less conservative. Ideally, we would have an offline computation that is, and so that's going to be efficient computationally, but also that's not conservative. And that hasn't been done in the literature. So let's see if we can do that. We have, let's look at recursive feasibility now. And if we have our MPC problem here, this result is in the box, and it's very well known in MPC, and it says that if the terminal set is a controlling variance set, then recursive feasibility is guaranteed. So that means that when we take this system with this dynamics and this constraints, we want our terminal set, that set, we need to design it so that it is controlling variant. And so what is a controlling variance set? A controlling variance set is a set that sits within, it's a set that's contained within the constraints. And by definition, any point that starts in this set is going to stay within the larger constraint set. So that's a controlling variance set. Now, this is how we write it mathematically, and this is how we write it in SLS. And SLS, just because it's closed loop, and it parameterizes that full closed loop, it just has this feature that all these expressions translate very naturally into the SLS parameterization. So ideally, we would want to compute this set so it's as large as possible to reduce conservatism. So we would want to compute, ideally, the maximal control robust invariant set. That means the set that contains all other control invariant sets. And the way to do that, there is an algorithm to do that. And the way we do that is we start with a constraint set, and we do this contraction. We ask the question, where should I have started so that I'm guaranteed to end in the green set? And we find the yellow set. And we ask this question again, where should I have started so that in the next step, I'm going to be in the yellow set? And we find this pink set. And we keep going and going and going until we keep finding the same set over and over. And that's our maximal control invariant set. Now, this control, the maximal control invariant set assumes that any input can take us there, but that's computationally more complex to deal with. And it's reported again in the MPC literature that really the best control input in practice is the input from the unconstrained controller. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to impose that input to be the input from the unconstrained controller, and instead of computing the maximal control invariant set, we're going to be computing the maximal positive invariant set for this closed loop system with the unconstrained controller, but the contraction algorithm works the same. So, and because there's robustness here, let me tell you how we can deal with this robustness in SLS. So we talked about how we dealt with robustness in the constraints before, and this is really no different. Let me highlight here that this phi x and phi u are from the closed loop unconstrained controller, and this f function tells us how do we compute the next set. And I'm assuming that all the constraint sets are polytopes here. So for the nominal case, we just keep using the standard procedure that I described. We ask for the previous set, and that's it. And for the robustness cases, this is a little bit more convoluted, but again, these expressions maybe sound familiar from their previous constraints because they really only rely on duality. Same thing for this one, and that's it. But really, what's important about these sets is that they're separable, meaning each of the subsystems can compute their own set. And that's really enough for the computation of this set. So we're going to really take advantage of this when it comes to computing and implementing this algorithm. So here's how the algorithm works. Each of the subsystems has to compute a certain components of phi. And they need to, in order to compute this set, they need to know where these are, what the constraints on those are. So we're going to be green subsystem, and we're not going to talk to blue subsystem. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our constraint set, the constraint set that's relevant to the system. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to share information with the neighbors. So pink subsystem also has a version of what the constraints for those components are going to be, and it might have its set might contain more components, but we take just the projection, and so we update our set to be the intersection of those, and now we perform this computation, which I said was separable. So we just it's enough for this subsystem to have its own knowledge of its own set to perform this computation, and then we keep going until we find we keep finding the same set. And that's it. That's how we find with a localized computation the maximal positive robust invariant set for the system. And this is the mathematical expression. So we have achieved this recursive feasibility guarantees, and we have done so with an algorithm that can be computed offline. And we are computing a minimally conservative set because the set is almost as large as we can go, because it's the maximal positive for the unconstrained controller. So now let me tell you how we deal with asymptotic stability. Again, in the MPC literature, this is a very linear result, there, under this conditions, these 4 conditions, we are guaranteed to be asymptotically stable or input to stay stable in the robust case. So what are those conditions? The conditions is that if the cost function is continuous and positive definite, we can achieve that because that's our choice of the cost. Same thing for the constraint set. It has to contain the origin and be closed. That's also something that it's up to us when we design the problem. For the terminal set, it has to be control invariant, which we know it is because I just showed you how we can compute it. And then the last condition is that the terminal cost is a Lyapunov function. Now, it turns out that whenever you have a term and robust invariant set, you can compute its corresponding Lyapunov function, and you can do it in this way. It's going to be the Minkowski functional of this set. And so what we can do is we can incorporate, so we've achieved that, but now we have a little bit of a problem because when we put that into the problem statement, we have this nu, which is the scalar. And what happens here is that if we want to distribute this, the subsystems are going to have to agree on what the value of this nu is. And we don't need to talk to every subsystem. It suffices to do this local consensus. So we agreed with our neighbors on what this value is, but still we are introducing local coupling here. So we can go back to what we had, and now we're changing this assumption slightly, we're relaxing it. So now if I'm a subsystem, my cost and my constraints not only depend on my state and my input, but also the state and the inputs of my neighbors. So now what that means is that these subproblems are no longer row-wise separable, but this problem stays still column-wise separable. So I can still do ADMM, and the last 2 steps I can still separate, no problem. Now for the first step, it's a consensus problem, so I can actually solve it with consensus, and I omit the details here for the sake of time, but we can actually solve this with ADMM. It's a very classical way to solve consensus problems. So instead of solving this one optimization, we're going to have to solve this ADMM with 3 steps. But the advantage here is that 2 of those steps are in closed form, and in practice, this has proven to be pretty fast. So the modifications really that we have to make to our original algorithm are that we're just solving this problem with ADMM and nested into the bigger ADMM, and that's it. So in this way, we have a distributed and localized MPC framework that has minimally conservative guarantees. The terminal set we can compute offline, so it's not adding to the computational burden, and we only modify slightly our online algorithm to accommodate for this coupling. And in this way, we have guaranteed asymptotic stability as well. Let me show you some computational results. So again, we're looking at this node, and I'm showing you here what happens when we don't have guarantees, when we have terminal set only, and when we have terminal set and terminal cost. When we don't have guarantees, the problem becomes unfeasible here. But when we have terminal set, the problem keeps going, only that it keeps oscillating up and down between the bounds. And when we have terminal cost, this oscillation is damping. So that's the advantage of terminal cost. Here, we can also do that in polytopic noise. In this particular case, there is really no difference between terminal set and terminal cost, but when we don't have guarantees, the problem becomes unfeasible. And something that's also really exciting is that I'm showing here the difference between how optimal my problem is without guarantees and how optimal my problem is with guarantees. And so here's where the conservatism would show up. And really, these plots are in the order of 10 to the minus 3. So we're basically not introducing any conservatism, and we're and at the same time we are achieving all of these guarantees for asymptotic stability and recursive feasibility. Also, in terms of runtimes, so this is my offline algorithm to compute the terminal sets, and runtime really does not increase, like it plateaus with the size of the network. When we increase the size of the network, but it does increase with the size of the local region, because once again, the size of the local region is really what dominates these computations. And lastly, for our online algorithm, I said that I was introducing this ADMM here, so that could potentially make us slower. But if you remember runtimes from the previous plots that I showed you, they're on the same order of magnitude. So it really does not increase complexity all that much. And again, it does not increase with the size of the network. So really, this concludes the first part of the talk, where I've presented the framework that we developed, how it achieves this distributed and localized synthesis and implementation, and how we can also do so with minimally conservative guarantees. So now I wanted to explore a little bit more the role of locality and whether it's only useful for this distributed settings or whether it can be useful beyond that. So we're going to go ahead and look at that. So the first question that we looked into is how when is it that imposing locality constraints is as optimal as not imposing locality constraints as when we solve this problem in the centralized way? And so this is a question that I get often, because I often say that imposing this isolated neighborhoods is really the key to this first part of the talk, and how much advantage we can get out of that. And so a question I get asked a lot is, well, what do you lose by doing that? Do you lose performance? And this is a very natural question to ask, because really when I don't have locality constraints, I'm optimizing over all the space of possible trajectories. But when I include locality constraints, I'm restricting the closed loops that I can consider. So really, I have this other space over which I'm optimizing, which is a subspace of the first one. So it is very plausible that that I would just lose the optimal solution by I would be more suboptimal when I introduce locality constraints. So what we explored here is, when are these subspaces equal? And we concluded that the rank of the subspace is this is not surprising, is the number of inputs times the instantations that I'm considering. And we also have some results of the rank of this other subspace. And the rank of this other subspace, the computations are a little messy, but it's basically a linear, a matrix multiplication of a combination of the A and B matrices and the initial condition with some components zeroed out because of the locality constraints. And what's also really nice about this is that we can perform these computations mostly in a localized way. So each of the subsystems can compute their own matrix, with their own patch of the A and B matrix and their own patch of the initial condition. And then we can put all the matrix together. And when the rank of this matrix is equal to NU times C, then the D that we considered is globally optimal, and meaning it does not impact or performance, as opposed to not having locality constraints at all. And if the rank is smaller than that, then we can increase the D and try again. And oftentimes we can find a very small D that still achieves this global optimality for the sparse networks that we're considering. So here's the example that I've been showing you throughout the talk. And in this case, it turns out that for this subsystem that we've been looking at, the solution, well, and for the whole network, but in particular, this subsystem, the solution is as optimal as when it only talks to this neighbors, no matter how big we make this network, as when it talks to the whole, to more subsystems or even the whole network. And we've seen that when we increase the size of this neighborhood, our computational runtime degrades. So really, choosing a D here doesn't hurt at all our performance, and it makes us more computationally efficient. So that's what we found in this work. And now it complements very nicely with this hardware implementation, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So what we did here is we wanted to explore the implementations of these algorithms in the hardware. And because I said that MPC was very useful for a wide variety of applications, but what I didn't say, and it's true, is that a lot of the times this are restricted to slow applications, just because solving this optimization problem online it's very slow. And this is especially true when you have large scale systems. So what people have been doing is one of two things. So either they rely on computational enhancements, where they're basically tweaking their algorithms to to make computations just more efficient, or they work on implementing these algorithms in state-of-the-art hardware. So people rely either on efficient computations or parallel computations. But we noticed that in the literature what's missing is that a lot of the times people are forgetting that the MPC problem that they're solving a lot of the times has constraints that just make it very amenable for this hardware implementation, just because the hardware has some communication constraints that are very similar to the constraints that we're capturing from our system that we're trying to simulate. So what we did here is we tried to implement this in GPU, and GPU has a lot of threads, like on the order of millions. And these threads all perform computations in parallel, but these computations are very simple. It can only be additions or multiplications, basically. And for the information sharing among the threads, it's not like one thread rise is accessible to all of the other threads unless we do something very costly. But in general, people who program in GPU, they really have to deal with this constraint where they have to create groups of threads, and these groups of threads, only if two threads are in the same group, they can share information and access their local memory. Otherwise, they cannot share information. So basically, they are restricted to local information exchanges, only that this is among disjoint groups of threads. So a thread cannot live in two different groups. And this is just very reminiscent to what I've been talking about, which is these subsystems perform parallel computations with local information exchanges only. So what we did here is, well, I said that GPU only, the threads only solve for very simple computations, and our problems had to solve for this optimization. So in this paper here, we tried to solve that issue, and we got away with not having to solve, in some cases, not having to rely on optimization solver, and we basically are able to compute our algorithm with simple computations only, and that's what we show in this paper. And we took a step further too, and we found a sort of clever solution to deal with this problem of disjoint groups of threads, because in the subsystems in the standard DLMPC, pink subsystem can communicate with green and with blue, but that's not true in GPU because pink either belongs to the group of green or the group of blue. So we created an implementation where we overcame this issue. In this other paper, I don't have time to go through the details. And so now in this implementation, each of the threads is basically computing the computations that would correspond to each of the subsystems. So just to show you the enhancements here, this is just when we do the tweaks in the algorithm to achieve this simple computations. We achieve an order of magnitude faster runtimes. And I don't show here the results from GPU because the plots are a little harder to explain, but basically we can get down another order of magnitude from the hardware implementation. So, and I said in the literature, people follow either one of these two approaches, but the picture is kind of fragmented here. People either do one or the other, and they're forgetting when they do that. A lot of the times they're forgetting about the very own problem statement that they're solving. And so what we try to do here is we try to, using efficient computations and parallel computations, really accommodate how this problem statement can fit into the hardware, just because the constraints in the problem statement really fit the constraints that the hardware has. So that's what we had for this part. And really these two last works that I described together, I think really make a really nice combo, because even if you don't want to do distributed MPC and you're not worried about distributing these computations among subsystems, you might still benefit of this approach if you have a large scale network, because a lot of the times including locality does not impact your global optimality, but at the same time, it can let you perhaps optimize perform your computations more efficiently in GPU, just because of this locality constraints. So, so that's another possible application of this work that's not even related to distributed MPC per se. And the last part of this work is data-driven. So I went on and on about how solving this problem for this large scale network was really hard, and how we needed to do something else to compute it in this distributed and localized way. And we found a way to do that. But now what I didn't say, and it's often true, is that finding a model for those systems is sometimes even harder than performing those computations. So a lot of the times we don't even have a model for these systems. And what people do in the literature is they either rely on global data, so subsystems have to gather data from the whole system, or they use local data, but with approaches that rely on a lot of information sharing that would be costly online. So thankfully, there's a version of SLS that allows for data-driven, and it relies on the Williams lemma. The Williams lemma basically says if we have a subsystem, we can parameterize its states and its input with past trajectories. And these matrices have to be full rank. So this is Williams lemma in state space. And of course, because SLS is just a parameterization of that, we have a version of Williams lemma in SLS variables, and here it is. So what we could do is we could go back and replace the constraint that includes this model by this other constraint where we're only relying on data. Now the problem here is, well, we're introducing this new decision variable G by doing that. So the question is, what is the structure of G? Is it still amenable for distribution and localization? So this is not a trivial question, because this is the relationship between phi and G. And when we want to impose this structure on phi, what does it result in G? So, or how can we distribute this computation for G? So if we have all this network, we could distribute the columns of G across the different subsystems. But now in order to fulfill those locality constraints and make those elements of that would correspond to the green row 0, we would need to make sure that this product is 0 for the columns that correspond to all of the subsystems in the network, basically. So we would need this global communication exchanges. However, thankfully, we were able to show that we only need to talk to the subsystem in the boundary, so blue subsystem, and if we achieve that to be 0, we don't need to worry about anything else in the network beyond that. So that's nice, and we were able to write the constraints in this way. But another concern that we had is, well, these matrices have to be full rank. So it's plausible that we need just to collect trajectories from all the systems in the network, and that would also hinder of our ability to localize, because we would still need this local computation, this global information exchanges. However, we were able to show, and I can't get into the details of this, that it's just not necessary. It's enough to know the trajectories from the systems in our neighborhood in the boundary, and that's what we need. So that's really nice, because that really lets us write the locality constraints also in terms of G in a way that we can distribute and localize. We can use an algorithm that's very similar to the one that I described. And in this way, we can achieve the distributed and localized implementation of MPC without a model and just with data. And this work is only true for the nominal case. We haven't looked at what happens when we have disturbances. So these are simulation results. The data-driven case and the model-based case just give the same result. This is the amount of data that we would need and how it increases with the size of the network. Turns out it does not. We don't need to collect more data no matter how big we make our network, and that wouldn't be true in the centralized case. So that's thanks to the locality constraints that we introduced. And again, the size of the trajectories that we need to collect, so the data that we need to collect scales with the size of the local neighborhoods, and that has been a pattern throughout the talk, and runtime does not scale with the size of the network. So that's all we had really for today, and hopefully I was able to show you how our approach allows for robustness, scalability, and guarantees how a lot of the times we have optimal achieve this global optimality, and also we are able to implement this efficiently in hardware, and how when we extend our results to data-driven, we can do that with low data requirements. And this really opens up a frontier. There's a lot of things that we haven't explored. So for instance, we haven't looked at uncertainty. This SLS seems to be very amenable for dealing with that, but we haven't looked at it. So that's a potential line of work. We haven't looked at delays, and delays are really important. So this is something that we should explore. And more importantly, the optimization algorithms. Optimization algorithms are really slow. They require a lot of communication exchanges. So what happens when there's communication dropouts or something like that? That's also something that we should explore. And lastly, how does this work fit in layer control architectures that we would want to build to make control systems more effectively? And this is kind of an internal joke. Heat maps, John has been telling me to do heat maps in my talk all throughout the whole week, and I didn't, so that's also in the next steps. And acknowledgments, this work wouldn't have been possible without, of course, John. He wasn't a co-author in any of these papers, but he let me join his group when I was still an aerospace engineering student, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'm particularly grateful because I recently approached him with this crazy idea of applying control theory to language. Any reasonable person would have told me to drop that and go do MPC. And instead, he was very eager to help me shape these ideas and just make this happen. So thank you so much, John, for that. I don't think anywhere else in the world I would have been able to do this. Also, Nick. Nick is really the father of DLMPC. It was his idea. He told me to work on it. He was very supportive and very patient with me. He always had very high standards and made me be very rigorous. So I'm very grateful for that too. And I think I really learned a lot with him. James is also a huge piece of DLMPC. He worked a lot in the papers with us. He helped us with the writing and checked our results. And it was great working with him too. Shihao, I'm so thankful to Shihao. He mentored me throughout the 2 years of the pandemic. He was meeting with me for 2 hours every week. He taught me all I know about hardware implementations. And he really coached me in a lot of ways in research. So I'm just very, very thankful to Shihao. Lisa's here. Lisa's been a great collaborator. I'm so honored to have been worked with her. It's always been so awesome to share ideas with her. She's always been very supportive too, not just in the work, but also emotionally. So thank you so much, Lisa. And Fengjun is Nick's student. He worked with me on the data-driven stuff. And he's very fun to work with. And I'm just very grateful that I got to team up with him. Of course, a lot of the people who have been with me in this journey in one way or another, I'm very grateful to all of them. And lastly, ChatGPT made it to my acknowledgments too. It came a little bit too late to help me write the papers and make my thesis, but it did give me good advice on how to prepare for today. And I think ChatGPT really has brought the point home, just beyond the engineering companies, but also to public offices and to the street, of why we need a better principled way to control the outputs that these algorithms give us, and how these algorithms can sometimes be seen as safety critical systems. And so I'm very grateful to all the people who were on board with my ideas, and I'm very excited to start working with them for my next steps. And that's all I have. Thanks so much for coming.